Hello there, everyone, and welcome back after a one-week hiatus for GenCon to our little show here we call The Metagame. The show where we not only talk about board games, but sometimes talk about talking about board games. I'm your host, Chaz Marler. Actually, if I can actually get the frog out of my throat, I'm Chaz Marler, not Chaz Marler. And I'm not the only host of this show, because this show is done in tandem with the live streaming YouTube comment chat area. In fact, if you're watching this chat, I invite you to add statements, comments, and questions in the chat using the hashtag Bing the Metagame, or TMG for short, to make it easy to type. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to present a topic and chat inanely about it for a little while, and then periodically throughout the show, I'm going to turn it over to the YouTube live stream chat, and we're going to see what the people chatting have to say to contribute. And then I'll make inane comments based on the chats, and we will continue ad infinitum from there. Today's topic has a little bit to do with GenCon, because I am sure that I can find the window that has my notes in it, which I put right over there. And now that I've done that, I can tell you that when I was at GenCon, there's always a few hot games at GenCon. And it seemed to me that the hottest of the hot games at GenCon was a game from Portal Games called Cry Havoc. I've played it. I actually played a prototype of it way back at BGGCon last November. And it's been neat to see this game evolve. But Cry Havoc sold out super fast. It was super popular. I got to play it there. It's the closest thing in board game form to a real-time strategy game like StarCraft that I've ever seen. It's super enjoyable, asymmetrical play, and it was super hot. In fact, it was being scooped up so quickly by people that I saw more than one tweet taking pictures of the pile of Cry Havoc games they had there with the hashtag Insta-Buy, saying, hey, you gotta go buy this game, Insta-Buy. And so that got me thinking about, because I hear that coming up more and more often, and it got me thinking about this Insta-Buy culture that we have as board gamers. Now, first of all, before we get into the subject, for anyone who wants to be more in the know, what do I mean by Insta-Buy? Well, when it comes to board gaming, at least to me, Insta-Buy means purchasing a game sight unseen. You haven't even played it yet. You maybe even haven't even seen what's in the box. But just based on certain criteria, you know you're going to buy this game sight unseen. So, is that a good thing to do? Is it healthy for our industry? Is it wise in the long run? Or is it a sign, actually, of the health and quality of the products that our industry produces? That's what I want to discuss today with everyone. So what I have is I have a list of kind of the top 5 areas of board game development that could result in triggering an Insta-Buy in someone. So I'm going to go down these 5 aspects of board gaming. I'm going to talk about my experience of whether or not that's enough to trigger the Insta-Buy flag for me. And then I want to see if those same triggers are enough to make someone else be the criteria by which they decide they're going to Insta-Buy a game or not. What games you have Insta-bought and why. So that's what I want to cover today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my little YouTube chat over here. I'm going to start my little search going to start highlighting the TMG hashtags. And I'm going to move some other windows out of the way because there seems to be an awful lot of windows today. So let me get started and talking about, let me start out by kind of talking about my philosophy on Insta-buying and my history. I was trying to rack my brains because I don't think I'm typically an Insta-buyer. I think the best way to put it is I'm somewhat incredibly greedy with my money. So I like to make a wise purchase decision. So I'll research games usually. Back in high school when CDs were coming out, and CDs were like $18 to $20 a piece, and they were the new thing, but the audio quality was great and all the music started coming out on CDs. A friend of mine and I would we would go down the music store like every other weekend or so. But and he would go to like the $3 bargain bin or something else, and he'd just scoop up handfuls of CDs, and he would just buy 7 or so of these $3 CDs that way. But me, with my $20, I would have researched a specific band as much as possible up to that point. I found everything I could, read the liner notes almost if I could have, for the lyrics, and seen everything. And I'd research all of these bands as much as possible. And we always joked about this comparison because it seemed that more often than not, he came away with the better music than I did. But anyway, so that's one thing. And another kind of comparison in terms of what actually could get me to Insta-Buy. So that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is I was thinking about when I would collect comic books. Because I actually, 99% of the time when I would collect a comic book, it was never because of the actual character in the comic book or the story or anything going on. I always collected comic books based on the artist team that was doing the comic. Artists like Gary Frank, Joe Mad, and others, I would actually nomadically jump around from one comic book series to another just to follow those artists. And so my comic collection is really sporadic, and it's based always on following these artists around. When I found an artist that I liked, any comic they made, no matter what character it was, any comic they made would become an Insta-Buy for me. So I've seen, at first I thought I wasn't really prone to the Insta-Buy culture, but when I was looking back on my history, I noticed those two examples, and one thing that I did and did not go into the Insta-Buy mentality for. So I guess it kind of depends on the kind of products that you're going to purchase. So what about board games, though? Do I succumb to the temptation for Insta-buying in a board game? So when I was thinking about comic book artists, the first allegory towards board games that I thought of was, of course, board game artists. Board games are this fantastic animal because they incorporate all of this art into it. It's kind of the necessary nature of it. So that's the first point I wanted to ask. Are there anybody who's listening out there? Do you have any artists out there in the world of board game design that you like their art so much that the board games that they do the art for are Insta-Buys for you? This seemed like a long shot to me, but I thought it was a good place to ask. I don't have personally any artists that when any game that they do the artwork for are Insta-Buys for me, where I'm just going to go buy that game because I see that they're the artist. However, there is one, when I was doing my research, I did discover that yes, there is one artist out there who, when I see his art being used in a game, will not make me buy it instantly, but it will get me interested in a game I may not have otherwise have been looking at, and will be one of the swaying decisions as to whether or not I buy that game. And that artist, I have an example here of his work, one of his pieces of work, is Josh Capel, who is the artist for Garden Dice and Belfort and several other games. I absolutely love his art style. He's my favorite board game artist. His art reminds me of the similar style to the comic book artists that I liked. So those artists whose work would get me to buy a comic book sight unseen, Joshua's illustrations have that same feel to me, and I just there's something about his illustration, his graphic design work that I really, really enjoy. So actually, Garden Dice right here, the reason I pulled this one off the shelf is because Garden Dice is, it wasn't an Insta-Buy when I discovered that Josh was the artist, but when I discovered this game, I was a little interested in it, and I was like, okay, that might be one to maybe add to the wish list, you know. But then when I discovered that he was the artist for it, I started looking through the illustrations that he was doing. That is the determining factor that swayed my opinion and caused me to actually purchase Garden Dice in the first place. And I'm really glad I did, because I'm a big advocate for Garden Dice. I think it's a really overlooked little game, but it's a really neat game with some very unique mechanisms with the way that the dice and the kind of ripple effect of the tiles that you place are done. Really enjoy it. And so if it wasn't for Joshua's artwork, I probably would not have tried Garden Dice. And I'm really glad that his artwork is what swayed me to do it. The closest other thing I could think of at this point was also Ashes. Because I think I've mentioned in a previous episode, I recently allowed Ashes to replace Doomtown Reloaded. I retired Doomtown from my collection, and I replaced it with Ashes. And so I'm allowing Ashes to be the LCG that I'm following at this point. And the artwork, and I'm sorry I'm drawing a blank on the artist's name, I'm sorry, but the artist in Ashes, her work is fantastic. And while it wasn't the same magnitude of a deciding factor as Joshua's artwork was, I do appreciate her artwork so much that it didn't hurt things. I was looking for a different LCG, and all things considered, it's like, well, Ashes not only has some unique ideas and it is fun, it also, the artwork is fantastic. So there's two examples of artists who, again, for me, don't trigger the Insta-Buy flag for me, but have definitely been deciding factors in artwork. So let's go over to the comments here. Let's talk about artists and let's see what some people are saying. I'm going to see if I can find anyone talking about artists yet so far. I apologize. I'm skipping some of the first initial comments. I'm sorry. We'll come back to those. Let's see here. All right. Insta-Buy, I need to redo my search because it stopped highlighting. And here we go. Okay, artists, art. Comics, all right. So let's see, Sasha, let's start off here with Sasha. And let's see here. Sasha mentions a big advantage of living in Germany. Oh, all the way from Germany. We have an international audience. Thank you very much. I can't Insta-Buy most games, says Sasha, since it often takes a while for them to get to our retailers here, unless I pay way too much for shipping. I'll hear about most games that interest me before I have a chance to buy. Oh, that right there is a very interesting aspect of the Insta-Buy mentality that I actually hadn't considered. If the games are coming out in the US, games that do come out in the US first, is the Insta-Buy mentality part of our American culture? Is this something that by our own means of production here and marketing and stuff like that, is Insta-Buy actually something that we deal with or do here in the States that other places simply don't because they're on a different time frame for board game releases? That is a very nice aspect of this conversation. So thank you, Sasha. Interesting as usual there. Speaking of as usual, next comment comes from Kabuki Kid, who usually has the first comment, but this time I let Sasha beat you to it. But Kabuki Kid mentions, I do think a lot of people Insta-Buy based on a designer because they really like intent to trust with making good games. Hold that thought, Kabuki, because I have a gut feeling that we may be talking about designers in just a minute. So I'll come back to that after the artists discussion here. So you're as usual, you're one step ahead of me. All right. See, David Redford mentions that as a parallel to the discussion on comics, some people Insta-Buy based on designers. Again, I like where this is going, but we'll come back to that in just a moment. Let's see here. Okay. Oh, Kay mentions, does Ryan Lockett count? And I apologize, I always get his last name wrong. That's a really good question. And actually, I'm going to add him to my notes here. We'll come back to Ryan Lockett in just a second. And the reason we'll come back to Ryan Lockett is because Ryan Lockett is a Renaissance man in the world of board games. He does the game, he is the designer, the self-publisher, and the artist, all in one. He does it all for the games that he produces. I believe it's Red Raven Games is his company. And so we'll come back to Ryan in just a minute, kind of this all-in-one package. But that's a really good one. And yes, I would say that he counts, definitely. For the sake of this conversation, a Ryan Lockett game, if that's an instant game, if any game he develops is an Insta-Buy for you, he definitely counts in this conversation. All right. Let's see. Toronto 1967. Time travels all the way here to mention that no, I really like some artists/sculptors, but it won't make me Insta-Buy. Okay? So there's one where artists don't necessarily carry the weight in the purchase decision. And then Sasha mentions again that art-wise, I would say that I'm willing to buy any card game Fernanda Suarez does for the art, as long as it's not collectible. Is Fernanda Suarez, is that the artist from Ashes? Correct me if I'm wrong there. And also Dead of Winter, I believe. The name sounds really familiar. But anyway, but yes, I know the name, and I know that that's quality artwork that she produces. Okay. Thank you very much for that. And Oda mentions that artists won't make me buy a game on their contribution alone, but it will make me look closer at a game. Two artist examples are Vincent Dutrait and Fernanda Suarez. Michael mentions that which games are more fun for you, games that you Instabot or games that you researched? Ooh, that's a really good question. And actually, that's a good point to segue back to the next point here. That's one of the things that I was wondering about during my research this week into this episode, going back to my example of my friend and I in high school, how I would research all of these CDs, and he would just go in and scoop out a bunch out of the bargain bin, and how it seemed like his music that he picked out was always appreciated more. I wondered if that had something to do with it. In terms of board games, which ones do I end up enjoying more? The ones that I Insta-Buy or the ones that I fastidiously research? I'd have to say that, honestly, it's probably 50-50. There's always surprises that happen when you Insta-Buy, and there's always disappointments that happen even when you research a game. I mean, like, if you Insta-Buy, best case, if you Insta-Buy, the worst case scenario is, I should have researched that, but what should I have expected? If you research a game, best case scenario is that you love it. So you kind of have, the odds for and the odds against the game being good, depending on which approach that you take necessarily. And, I don't, the purpose of this discussion isn't to say if Insta-buying is bad to do an unwise purchase decision. Everyone can do with their disposable income whatever they want. I'm more curious on if it's something that we as gamers, I just wonder how many people, how much people think about this, and if it's as widespread as I thought. And I think the only thing to do when I've painted myself verbally into a corner like this is to continue to my next point, because honestly, I got sidetracked there and I don't know where I'm going. So I will turn sharply left over to the next bullet point on my list here and get back on the road by talking about designers, because it's already come up a little bit. And there's no way to keep the discussion going than to talk about the things that people have already started to discuss. So the next thing after artists that I went and thought about was designers, because that's the next logical step in the train of thought, I figured. Because you have these designers, and what's really fascinating about the board game industry is that these designers are producing a lot. Some designers are very, very prolific, and they'll design multiple games, and they'll create like this catalog of games. And every designer has some misses, but the ones that have a lot of hits seem to almost take on this rock star type of persona almost when you're at conventions and stuff. And it's really fascinating to see that even in this little niche industry of board games, We have these superstars that say someone's name and they're like, oh, I love that guy's work, and you'll bring some people are bringing copies of their game to have them sign them and everything. It's fascinating that even in this little industry, that type of cream can rise to the top. So I was thinking about, first of all, kind of if there was one designer right now whose work that I thought was an Insta-Buy, even if it wasn't for me, but for everybody, whose work would that be? And the name that came to mind quickest, of course, was Eric Lang, designer of Blood Rage, the upcoming, I believe he unveiled Rising Sun at GenCon is going to be one of his next games coming up. And Marvel Dice Masters, I believe he was involved in that. And Eric Lang seems to be on this super hot streak right now. I'm thinking if there's any game designer whose actual work is an Insta-Buy for a large majority of people, it's probably Eric Lang's. So is Eric Lang an Insta-Buy for you? If so, why or why not? And who is the designer who is your own Insta-Buy person? As for me, before I turn over to the comments here, for me, I think the closest thing I have to an actual designer who is an Insta-Buy for me actually is probably Emerson Matsuuchi. He's the designer of the card game Tricks and Treats and Volt Robot Battle Arena, and also Spectre Ops. And upcoming game from Z-Man Game, Caravan. And what really I appreciate about Emerson's designs is he will something not necessarily come up with a completely original concept, but what it seems like he's really good at doing is he's good at taking an existing idea and like say with Spectre Ops, the whole idea of hidden movement, and he will streamline it and kind of not simplify it to the point where it's no longer fun or it's simplistic in a kid's game, but he's good at taking out the fat and streamlining a game so you can concentrate on the gameplay experience of it. One comparison I like to make is the comparison of Robo Rally versus Volt. Similar concepts, but to me, Robo Rally is just tedious and overwrought, where Volt is streamlined and was a real big surprise at how much I enjoyed it. They're both programming robot type of games, but the approach to each is a little bit different. So that's why Emerson is on my list. As if there was an artist that was a potential Insta-Buy designer, if there was a designer who was a potential Insta-Buy designer, that would be the one for me. All right, the comments here, I apologize. The comments today are just bouncing up and down. I'm losing my place over and over again in my comments, so I'm going to take a wild stab here at trying to find my place in the comments. I apologize. So let's go here and start with Michael, who asks, speaking about designers, how do you feel about Bruno Catala and Antoine Bauza? Those are two names that I respect in terms of design. But to be honest, me personally, I'm sure I enjoy their games, but for some reason, they don't stay on my radar and make that much of an impact to me. They're always kind of there in the background of, oh yeah, I like that game. Oh, look, it was one of his. Kind of like Stefan Feld. Feld games are that way. It's like, what is this game I am playing? Why, you are playing a Feld. I enjoyed this quite much. Thank you. Kind of that level of kind of background is where those two designers come onto my radar. So I appreciate their work and they're fantastic designers, but for some weird reason, they're always kind of in the background to me, and I don't know why. Okay, Equip Kilt pulls out this question. I think when I first got into the hobby, I was more prone to Insta-Buy games as I had no prior knowledge to base my decisions on. That's a good point. As my interest grew, so did my knowledge of designers and publishers. That's a good point about Insta-Buy. Is the Insta-Buy mentality something that happens earlier on in the life cycle of a board gamer. When you come into the hobby and you're building your collection and you don't really have a lot of other games to evaluate your choices against, are you more likely to go into the Insta-Buy? I'm going to take the opposite point on that, and I'm going to say actually that perhaps, at least in my opinion, perhaps the new people, someone coming into the hobby, maybe is actually more prone to do their research and really try to research a lot of games. And then after they've amassed a collection and they're more familiar with what's out there, then they're start to say, oh, yeah, that's a worker placement game that uses this mechanism by this guy. Oh yeah, I'm buying that. And I base that just on my own experience. Back in 2012, when I was getting into the hobby again, I know I watched a lot of board game reviews and board game media. That was at the point where it was still possible to watch every review that Tom Vassell would put out during the course of a week and stay caught up on every video that he released. And I remember going through in 2012 and stuff, and I remember midway through the week going, oh man, I've watched everything he puts out this week. Now I got to go like 4 days with no more Dice Tower videos. So I remember consuming as much media to research and find out as much about these games as possible back then. And today, I'm a little more lax sometimes in my research when it comes to games. And I think that comes with experience. However, that's just one person's experience, and everyone else, might have a different tack. Good question though. Thank you, Equip Guild. Oda mentions that designers definitely hold more weight on my buying choices. But like you said, even the best designers have some pretty large misses. An example being Uwe Rosenberg with Hengist, Hengist. I haven't even heard of Hengist. I know Uwe Rosenberg is the designer of Caverna and Fields of Arle. And I believe Patchwork as well. Was that an Uwe Rosenberg design? It's on my shelf, but my monitor's in the way, so I apologize. I can't see it. But I haven't even heard of Hengist, and perhaps that's why. But there you go. There's a really good example of a track record, how it can vary for a designer. All right, and Kay mentions the pick of Rob Daviau. I don't know how Werewolf Legacy will work, but I'm buying it anyway. We're going to come back to Rob Daviau and some of those products that he's developed in a little bit, so I'll continue on and come back to that. Bob mentions that his designers, here we go, some names here. He's naming names. Some of his designers that are Insta-Buys are Uwe Rosenberg, Friedman Fries, and Matt Leacock. Again, names that seem really common when you're talking about designers, and if you were to make like a top 20 list of designers, those are definitely designers that I think would be on that top 20 in terms of popularity and quality of their work. Kabuki Kid continues with Lang as an Insta-Buy to pay attention to person. So Eric Lang is mentioned as someone who's instantly pay attention to, but not necessarily an Insta-Buy. Anything that Eric Lang makes gets my attention, at least. And I think that's true with a lot of designers. That's true with even Eric Lang for me as well. Anything that he produces, I'm going to take a good long look at, even if I don't add it to my own personal collection. We'll do one more here before we pop back to the next thing on my list, which is Satya's comment of, while there are some designers who did a lot of good games, they also created games that simply do not interest me. So looking closer at their new games, yes. Insta-Buy, no. So we kind of seem to have kind of a general consensus there, where, like I mentioned, artists will cause me to have a game catch my eye. It seems like a lot of people, the designers are the same, but even more so, tenfold or so. The designers will really make you go, okay, where the artist might catch your eye when you see the game on the shelf. The designer you hear developing a game, you will put it on your radar to go find out about it even before it hits the shelf. All right, we're about at the halfway point, so I'm about to continue back to my own list here. But before we do, we're going to take a short intermission to thank one of our sponsor, well, not really a sponsor, but a sponsorette, I just wanted to mention that the metagame is made possible in part by the listeners like you, listeners like Nick, who is probably listening to this episode of the metagame while driving into Chicago on a Friday night. So thank you, Nick. I appreciated seeing you at GenCon, and I hope you have a safe trip into Chicago. Okay, let's continue. Let's continue trying to get words to come out of my mouth today. And let's do that by going to the next bullet point on the list here. And I wanted to talk about just real quick, the publishers themselves. Publishers was one that I thought would be interesting to mention because to me, just having a publisher that's something they make is Insta-Buy, totally a long shot for me. I couldn't think of a single publisher where anything that they produce, I'm going to buy. But I wondered if other people out there maybe had a different train of thought. Are there some publishers that everything they produce is an Insta-Buy? And that's why I wanted to come back to Ryan Lockett, the Renaissance man behind Red Raven Games, who is the artist, the designer, and the publisher all in one. Because technically that means if there's anyone out there, and I know Ryan has a lot of dedicated fans, deservedly so. So if there's anyone out there who any of Ryan's games are Insta-Buys for them, poof, there we go. There is a publisher who's an Insta-Buy publisher. So I think that Ryan Lockett from Red Raven Games is probably the closest thing that I could think of to an Insta-Buy publisher. But let's go back to the comments here. And let's see if anyone else has an Insta-Buy publisher. And I brushed over on that real fast, so it might take a minute for the comments to start coming up. So, okay, I'm where I left off in the comments, so let's go back and see if these start coming in. Well, the next one here, actually, the next one's from Michael, who has a question not necessarily about Insta-Buy, but does have a good question. Michael asks, will you ever make a top 100 games of all time list for the Dice Tower? Excellent, timely question, Michael. As part of the Dice Tower's Kickstarter stretch goals for this year, one of those stretch goals was when they hit a certain amount, I was going to make my top 100 games of all time list. And the Kickstarter did hit that stretch goal. And oddly enough, my top 100 games of all time is the actual very next series of videos that I will be starting to put on the Dice Tower channel. So yeah, throughout the month of August and beyond, that's what I'm doing there. So I'm sure that watching me rattle off a list of games will be super duper exciting to watch. So I'm looking forward to it, and I'm sure you all are too. Okay, let's see. Sir Francelot mentions that based on games that I've previously bought, my Insta-Buy would be for Matt Leacock because my family always likes his games, but I don't think I would ever buy without researching even just a little bit first. Okay, so there we have a designer who, even someone who hits it out of the park and is one of your family favorites, it's not totally Insta-Buy. Still needs some room for the research in that. So then that's fair. I think that makes sense. Okay. Boy, I apologize. The comments are just all over the place today. Trying to find off where we just left off. Oh, here we go. All right. Kabuki mentions, I often like Fantasy Flight games, so they are Insta-pay attention to, but not necessarily Insta-buy automatically yet again. Yeah, Fantasy Flight, when I was starting out in 2012 or so, I know exactly what you mean, because Fantasy Flight, especially back then, the quality of their components and such was, there were a few games that I did kind of almost Insta-buy from Fantasy Flight just to get the components into my collection at that point. And the game itself, actually, to be honest, was a little bit secondary. So yes, I can totally see with Fantasy Flight, especially when starting out. These days, with the increased quality of board game production, Fantasy Flight doesn't stand out as much to me as the speaking of quality. So I wonder if that has calmed down and if there's other companies that might be taking that place for new people. David Pedersen mentions a comment that I see and appreciate, but I'm going to come back to David because if I mention it now, it'll be a spoiler for something to come up. But thank you for contributing. Kay mentions Plaid Hat Games is definitely insta pay attention to, thanks to Kabuki, who now has coined that phrase, insta pay attention to, just because everything that I've played from them, they absolutely loved. So there we have Plaid Hat as a publisher who is insta consideration worthy. So we have Fantasy Flight, Plaid Hat. David mentions, I would imagine for some people the IP can be an Insta-Buy trigger. That's not on my list, and that's true. The IP, that is true. There's people that will scoop up everything Star Wars or Battlestar Galactica or anything like that. And I think that the IP is actually a really worthy addition to this list. Good one. Good catch there. And thank you, David. Okay, let's see here before my comments jump again. Ethan mentions, I'm not sure about Insta-Buy, but I always like to check out anything from Asmodi games. They're either somewhat complex, like the games Innovation and Equinox, or they're completely just ridiculous, like Meow and Flowerfall. Cool, that's Asmodi. That's a really good one. I don't hear as much about Asmodi as I used to, and so it's nice to see them mentioned. And you're right about the super complex versus the super light games. And it's neat when one publisher can have multiple games in their catalog that kind of straddle those different areas. It can be a double-edged sword. Sometimes it can dilute their brand, but sometimes it's nice to have that variation available. Okay. Kabuki Kid. I'm going to come back to that comment. I'm sorry, because again, spoilers. Sorry. Sasha mentions again that many publishers put way too many games to Insta-Buy them all. But some publishers put out enough good stuff to pay close attention to when their new releases come out. Sasha's examples being specifically Fantasy Flight Games and Plaid Hat, once again. Okay, and let's go one more here. Michael mentions that he's super excited. Oh, here's about the top 100 list. Insta-Buy for me, says Michael, would be a new Time Stories game because I do pay attention, and I do pay attention to Antoine Bauza and Bruno Catala, but the designer doesn't equal Insta-Buy. All right. Okay, so the mention of Time Stories is actually a really, really good one here because that brings me to the last point on my list because I was trying to figure out, I was not able to come up with anything that was an Insta-Buy on my list. And I know myself better than that. There's got to be something that's Insta-Buy out there. What is it that tempts me so that I am so enthralled that I will buy it sight unseen? And I figured it out. For me, it's not necessarily the game itself, but expansions. If I find a base game that I really, really enjoy, I will usually scoop up the expansions sight unseen. A couple examples that I came up with on my list were the game of all things Seasons. My wife and I always enjoy Seasons. It's one of her favorite games. And so when expansions for Seasons have come out, I've scooped those up. And the expansions for Seasons have always been hit or miss, actually. Usually an expansion for Seasons will introduce a new concept or mechanism. Like there's one that has a moon thing, a moon dice or something like that. But they'll also provide more cards to add into the card pool for building your engine. And even though the expansions for Seasons, usually what I do is we'll add the cards and add those to our card pool. And we don't always use the new mechanisms like the moon die or whatever. I don't know if we've actually used that in a game more than one time. But even though the maybe only 50% of the contents of the expansion will end up being used on a regular basis in the game, I think if there was another Seasons expansion, I would continue to scoop up sight unseen, Insta-Buy any Seasons expansion. Another one is like an LCG, ECG, whatever type of game. again, like Ashes. I retired Doomtown, but now that Ashes is kind of the one that I'm investing in, I will, as long as I continue to be playing Ashes, I'll probably continue to purchase all of the expansions for Ashes, just to add more cards to the card pool and keep the different cards available and different combos and stuff like that. So the LCG format, Ashes specifically, but that's one where, okay, yeah, that's something where, again, the expansions, I'm going to be buying sight unseen, insta-buying those. And the last one I thought of, again, was also expansions, was Heroescape. Oh, back in the day, one of the things, when my daughter was only like 1.5, 2 years old, one of the things that we would do on the weekends is we would drive down to the game shop, and I would take her with me, and we'd look at like the the Hobby games and all the little things, and we would go and we would pick out a Heroescape expansion, and we would get the Heroescape expansion. And she'd help me pick out which one based on what the little figures and stuff looked like, and we'd go home, we'd open it up and kind of walk them around on the table and stuff, and then I'd pack them away for playing later. But and especially when Heroescape was announced to be going out of print. Well, then we would continue doing that, and at that point, it didn't even matter if I'd already had that expansion. That was like the weekly thing we'd do, and I would go just knowing that I was not going to be able to get this game anymore after a while. I would just start, any expansion they had there that week, we'd pick out one, and I would get and add to the collection. Just kind of starting to accumulate as much Heroescape as possible, knowing that it was going to soon become unavailable anymore. So there you have expansions combined with the nice little wrinkle of going out of print. So I wanted to know if there was any games that the expansions are insta-buys for people, or if you've had any game, where when you heard that it's not going to become available anymore, did that sway your opinion and cause you to insta-buy it? Is it just me, or does anyone else have that issue too? So. All right, so let's go back here to the comment land, and let's see what's going on here. Oh boy, I apologize. The comments are just being unruly today, what with the bouncing and the moving and the can't find them. Here we go. All right, Kabuki mentions, I'm not even Insta-Buy for Magic the Gathering. No. I am one of those players who waits to see the individual cards and buys only the ones that I want. That is very interesting when it comes to Magic. I have barely ever heard that take on Magic. To be honest, the most common, and this is true, the most common approach to collecting Magic I've heard is that when a new expansion comes out, people will buy like a box, and they'll get a box of the boosters, and they'll go through the box. I have a friend of mine who's actually a level 2 DCI judge now, who always has, when he got into Magic, would always buy a few boxes. And when he got married, his wife and he decided that he would cut down to, I think, 2 boxes of boosters when the expansion came out, which was cutting back for him. And he's not the only person I've heard that would go out and get a whole box. So someone who actually goes through and like reads a visual spoiler and picks out the specific cards they want for Magic, that is actually a very unique approach to collecting Magic, to what I've seen in my own experience. So kudos for that. That's probably a just as good approach too, to get the ones you're looking for. Trevin mentions that he used to insta-buy any Heroescape expansion, sight unseen. Bravo. Yeah, I miss Heroescape a lot. Sasha mentions that expansions are easy to insta-buy. We already know if we like the game system, and more options and stuff are always nice. As long as the expansion doesn't totally just tank and ruin the game. I think that's rare, that an expansion is so bad that you would exclude it whenever you play, or even ruin the game experience. But I think the expansions are a pretty safe bet if you know you like the base game. So I'm glad to get a little bit of validation there with that one. Jason mentions that Red Raven and Stonemaier games are insta-buys for him. Ryan Lockett and Jamie Stegmaier have their own shelves in his collection. Ooh. Liking a designer/publisher so much that you not only Insta-Buy, but you have dedicated shelf space just for their games. That is a sign of a really quality, someone whose games really strike a chord with you. So that's, I should do that. Now I'm going to go and redo my whole game collection this afternoon, my whole shelving system, just because of that. So thank you for that. You've given me an afternoon activity there, Jason. David mentions that Time Stories does equal Insta-Buy for me as well, but of course, he's played the base game and all the expansions. So again, Time Stories is kind of this anomaly because each new set is a standalone. So do the new sets for Time Stories, do those count as expansions, or are they just new base games? I say expansions. And since I'm the only one with the microphone, we'll just assume that everyone agrees, and we'll continue on to the next question. I'm sure that if anyone doesn't agree, we'll find out in the comments or such, and it'll be an interesting discussion there. Let's see here, Time Stories. Michael mentions that expansions for favorite games do lead to Insta-Buys. So, for example, I love 5 Tribes, so I'll get the Thieves of Nakala expansion, even if it's just 7 cards. All right. Trevin mentions that Heroescape expansions were common. You could use multiple copies of the same one, which is true, which is another reason why scooping them all up didn't matter as much and was enjoyable. Ethan mentions, I don't think there's ever been a case where I didn't want the expansion for a game that I like. Let's see. And then Michael H mentions, oh, very true. If a game is not going to be available, then yes, that becomes top priority over fully researched games. Oh, that's talking about the out of print. Before we continue on with the comments then, I wanted to mention the thing about expansions. So it seems to me that we have a common thread here that many people, the majority of people seem to agree that if they like the base game, then yeah, the expansions are going to be a no-brainer. They're going to be an Insta-Buy. So, follow-up question that I had snuck up my sleeve here is that mentality does seem to be the majority with other people I've talked to as well. So, does that mentality of expansions being Insta-Buys, is that just a nice added encouragement for game developers to continue creating content for the games that they produce? Or is that leading to game developers and publishers releasing not fully completed games with the thought being that, oh, we'll just add more to flesh this out in an expansion? Are we getting less in our base games because the thought is becoming, oh, well, these people are going to be on the hook for expansions, so we'll just release the rest of the content in 1, 2, 3, or 4 expansions and just increase the longevity of the game that way, actually sell more product that way, and produce less content up front that way. I don't know if that's something that we're seeing in the industry or could happen, but it's something when it came to the Insta-Buy mentality of expansions that, since that does seem to be the majority, I'm wondering if that is having an effect on the games and the content of the games that are becoming available. Now that I've brought the whole group down with that whole downer of a thought, let's continue back to the chat and see if anyone can perk us back up here. Let's see. Here we go. Oh, thank you, comments. Thank you, microphone. I'm going to just throw everything on the floor. All right. We're down to like the last 10 minutes here, so I'll try to find the place where my comments popped away from us. Wow, we're back at Plaid Hat, expansions, Insta-Buy. Here we go. Thank you for your patience. So Nyrus Interactive interacts with us to mention that if we're not careful, an Insta-Buy culture can ruin a franchise. Although I believe most hobby board game publishers have a lot of passion for what they do and generally do want to create great games. Yeah, I've made some parallels to the movie industry and blockbusters and the quality of content that Hollywood seems to be pumping out. I think I mentioned that last time a little bit when we were talking about Kickstarters. And it makes me wonder, with some of these movies that come out that are just panned based on really popular IPs, is there in Hollywood, in the movie industry, is there a mindset that, oh, if we make a movie based on these characters, doesn't matter what we produce, we're going to be able to sell tickets and merchandise, and that's all that matters. With Insta-Buy culture, can that be applied and ruin a franchise within board games? Is it possible that a game will become so popular that it could start to suffer from sequelitis like movies, and those great games that people Insta-buyed, they'll start Insta-buying worse and worse content, which could cause them to stop buying games completely? I don't know, but I appreciate the thought. So since I don't, we'll move on to something I do know, which is that we have another comment here, which is, let's see, we'll pop in here. Kabuki mentions that, again, talking about Magic, also playing vintage Magic. So there's lots of different varieties of Magic that are available at the moment, which is true, which can allow you to insta-buy different types of sets and cards. Like Pauper Magic can let you just buy just commons and play with that, which I think commons are a lot easier to go in and just insta-buy, scoop up a bunch of commons sight unseen. So that's true. Different aspects, different variations of the game can lead to different insta-buy decisions. Trevin asks, are you playing Arena of the Planeswalker since you're a Heroscape guy? Yes, I so far have scooped up Arena of the Planeswalker and the first two. I think they have two expansions that have come out for it. I'm a little bit frustrated because it's one of those games where, since you're kind of have deck building and different armies to build and choose from, it's one where I think you need to have the pool of a lot of different characters available before it really gets good. But yes, it's on the shelf. It's in the collection. Speaking of shelves, Michael H. asks, what is your shelving system? And I'll let you know that I gave in a couple of years ago, and I'm one of the IKEA Kallax, Kallax, shelf people. I have, just this last weekend on the way back from GenCon, on the way home, there's an IKEA right by one of the airports near where I live. So I stopped by IKEA on the way home from GenCon and got the final little bit of shelving that I needed to complete my kind of shelf area. So I now have, in my little studio room here, across from me, I have my shelves, and it now goes across the wall like I wanted it to. I've been building it little by little, but that's the system I use. And there's no better video content than hearing someone talk about a shelf that you can't see. So even though as riveting as it may be to hear me talk about that, I think I'll move on to the next comments and questions here. Let's see here. Ethan mentions, I call the Time Stories modules expansions because they can't be played standalone. Oh, that's true. I guess you do need the base board and stuff. So yes, expansions they are. So let it be written, so let it be done. Thank you, Ethan, for reminding me about the base board and clarifying that. Okay, we're in the last few minutes. We're going to go the lightning round here. See how many of these that we can bounce off of each other for the rest of the time we have left. Sasha mentions again that speaking about all this stuff about Insta-Buys, the game must be good and playable for players to Insta-Buy the expansions. No one will buy the expansion that fixes a bad base game. That's a very good point. You have to have the good base game in order for the expansions to even be considered. I'm trying to think of some game that maybe contradicts that rule, but I can't at the moment. So if anyone can think of a horrible base game where the expansion came along and rescued that game and made it good, let me know, probably after this video goes live with the amount of time we've left. Let me know in the comments below this video. Let's see here. Trevin mentions that publishers do remove elements from a game just to sell as expansions. However, making a game as simple as possible helps it to sell. So it's not actually a bad thing. That's true. I think that's something that is true. Streamlining and keeping things simple can be really good. if the removal comes at the expense of gameplay, where it's done in a more malicious mindset of we're taking this out specifically to introduce later, even though the game needs it, well, then we have a problem. But yeah, I agree that sometimes you will take things out of a game just to make it easy to learn how to play, knowing that you're going to be adding layers to it later on. All right, and Ethan mentions that I don't think expansions being Insta-Buy necessarily incentivizes designers/publishers to push out unfinished games, and the rest as examples, because it hinges on actually liking the base game first. And that is a really, really good point. If you pull out too much, you're going to damage the base game. And like was mentioned just a little bit earlier, no one's going to buy an expansion for a shoddy base game. So that's true. So any designers that were considering doing that, remember, it is a very slippery, dangerous slope. And not recommended, because if you damage that base game, no expansion in the world is going to rescue it. Kabuki brings up a good question. What about some people who Insta-Buy because of speculation? Like Cool Mini or Not, or Simon. Those games that often sell for premium with their Kickstarter exclusives, so that some just buy it because they know they can easily resell it. That is a whole different potato right there. Yeah, people who Insta-Buy because of speculation. That's kind of similar to something we discussed last week a little bit, I think. It's almost an entire discussion in and of itself. So if anyone wants to flesh that out, let's do that in the comments below and see if there's enough content there to continue with its own segment, perhaps, in the future. All right. And my comments have just jumped again, and I lost all of my little search. Let's see here. Yep, they're gone. Oh, one last thing. Sir Francelot, here I caught his before we lost the comments. Sir Francelot mentions that I agree that base games should have enough content that there's no need to buy expansions. Expansions should be for adding variety and gameplay variance, not adding back in missing content. Sir Francelot, I agree with you absolutely. I'm sorry. As I am responding to your comment, my brain is desperately trying to make a Sir Mix-a-Lot reference or pun, and I just can't do it. So I'm still trying. I've got to try not to. So I'm going to save everyone the trouble and not work in a Sir Mix-a-Lot reference here. And I will instead just thank everyone for coming in and joining the discussion. And I'm going to end just with the one thing of, I've talked about artists, I've talked about designers, I've talked about publishers, I've talked about expansions that were Insta-Buys. But I'll leave you with the one game that I discovered that I realized, yes, was an Insta-Buy for me. And that is Seafall. Based on my experience with the Risk Legacy system and the Pandemic Legacy system, Seafall, it's been, 2 years now? I've been waiting for this game to come out. The instant that I saw it available for pre-order, sight unseen, I went and Insta-bought it. And there were piles of it at GenCon. And I was tempted to even just buy one there, even though I have one waiting to ship to me as soon as it becomes available for retail in just a couple of weeks. So basically, my experience with the Legacy system was enough where Seafall was a game, the only game in recent memory that I know that I went out of my way to purchase as soon as possible, knowing that I didn't care if I didn't know anything about it. I went out and scooped that baby up. And with that, I can see that the YouTube chat is helping me with the Sir Mix-a-Lot puns. Thank you very much. Like I mentioned, it always makes my job so much easier when the audience brings their own material. But with that, I'm going to bid adieu to you. And I'm going to thank everyone for joining me on this and remind you that, you know what, there's more stuff out there on this World Wide Web. In fact, For more board game news and reviews and commentary, be sure to subscribe and check out both the Dice Tower and the Pair of Dice Paradise YouTube channels. And be sure to continue the conversation with us about board games and board game media by following us on Twitter and joining us on Facebook as well. There's lots of good stuff floating around all over this World Wide Web for that. Until next time, I've been Chaz Marler, along with the YouTube chat section, and we've been playing the metagame. Until next episode, thank you so much, and I will talk to you all again real soon. Take care.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at coolstuffinc.com.
Okay, one Sir Mix-a-Lot reference, because I can't stand it. Since I was gone at GenCon and there was no metagame last week, I took a 1-week hiatus, but nobody's heard my latest. You thought Pod P was through? Well, metagame's back. This joke's on you. There you go. I feel so dirty. So dirty inside.